So you had a really interesting story in the beginning of the book when you were talking about the men that came to your house for the paper towel roll change, which is such an interesting job because I didn't know that was a job. But you told this story about how the house was filled with women and you were obviously a child at the time, and there was one man in the house and he just was kind of acting like a coward. So would you say that kind of created one of those main like pillars of your um belief systems, I guess, of like being brave and not being cowardly, was like that man's cowardice in the situation?
So certainly that was a formative experience that
Mhm.
showed me the disdain that I would eventually have for cowardly people in general, and certainly cowardly men. But I also think it's just the unique combination of my genes, right? I mean, you are the product of your unique genes,
Mhm.
whatever that implies. And so anything that we are is really a combination of our genes and our environment. I just think that I am endowed with the right set of traits, maybe right, maybe wrong, because it actually brings me a lot of emotional pain to always have to fight these fights. But I just cannot, I detest cowardice. It's one of the, I mean, when women fantasize about guys, they usually don't fantasize about the cowardly guy who sucks his thumb and cries in a corner, right?
Mhm.
Watching Bridget Jones' Diary while eating ice cream. They fantasize about the fireman or the Navy SEAL, because those archetypes reflect attributes that we desire, which is bravery, courage. And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is that regrettably, academia doesn't select for that attribute. Uh, I always argue that academics should be intellectual Navy SEALs, right?
Mhm.
We choose Navy SEALs based on, in part, their bravery and their courage, their willingness to go where others would be running away from.
Mhm.
Well, we should be doing the same thing in academia, right? You should go and criticize Islam if you think it's not a good, you know, belief system. You should criticize radical feminism, but that's not what happens in academia. In academia, people are selected based on herd mentality. Just do your research, put your head down, only speak about the very narrow areas of expertise that you have scientifically, and then keep your mouth shut. And I find that that's a terrible way to live as an intellectual. And so, yes, cowardice is something that I despise.
How how do you move forward, I guess, when there's no diversity of thought or philosophies on campus, when you have these like forbidden truths or forbidden topics? Like you're not allowed to talk about Islam, for example, which you do a lot on your Twitter and you do throughout the book. And I never really thought about it, but it is curious that you can't really criticize it or critique it or even just kind of examine it critically. Whereas you can mock Christianity all the time and that's totally fine. And even like, you can mock Jews and that's still kind of fine. But Islam is one of those untouchables. So I guess when did that start happening? And then how do we create diversity of thought when we have these forbidden topics?
Right. So several things to unpack. First, to give you a sense of the lack of diversity of thought, one of the things that I talk about in the book is the distribution of political affiliation of the professors.
Hmm.
So, for example, you could say, okay, across sociology departments, how many of the professors are affiliated with the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party? And you could do a similar thing in, say, Canada, where I reside. And the numbers are astoundingly horrifying.
Hmm.
The more prone to being parasitized by ideological beliefs a discipline is, the more it tilts to being exclusively leftist. So engineering or the business school where I'm housed is, while it still might be more leftist, it's much less so because, building a bridge requires certain commitment to a reality that idea pathogens can't destroy. You can't build a bridge based on postmodernist thought. You can't build a bridge based on feminist physics. And you can't build mathematical models of consumer choice or of the economy if you're in the business school based on feminist economics. And so, because those fields are rooted in downstream consequences linked to reality, it becomes a bit more difficult to be parasitized. On the other hand, in fields like sociology and that kind of stuff, then in some cases, you've got ratios of 44-1,
Hmm.
right? So there are 44 times more leftist professors than there are, say, Republicans. Now, some people will then retort, but that makes perfect sense, Professor Saad. I mean, academics are smart, and so of course they're going to be leftists, which I address that kind of imbecilic position in the book. On some issues, it's a fact. Evolution is a scientific fact. So there is no biology department where some biologists believe in evolution and some don't. That's resolved. But when it comes to, is the death penalty something that we should have? What should be our optimal fiscal policy? What should be our foreign policy? There are valuable positions on both sides of the aisle. So it's not as though there is only one set of positions that are veridical and everybody else is wrong. And so if you are a student in political science or sociology or economics, it would seem like we should have diversity of thought, because many of these discussions are not established scientific facts where we can listen to both sides of the story and actually be enriched from it. But unfortunately, that's not what academia has become. And so the only way to reverse that is for people to speak out against these sterile echo chambers. And again, regrettably, I'm one of the few in academia who does so, and certainly the one who does it with the least amount of fear, and across as many topics. So, for example, Jordan Peterson became famous for his gender pronoun stuff, but he doesn't talk against Islam, right? Whereas there is no sacred cow in my book. Everything is open to scrutiny. Everything is open to mockery. Everything is open, right? No ideology that is true should be protected from scrutiny. If it is true, then it should be able to withstand any stressors and still come out victorious. The reason why you put these echo chambers that protects an ideology is because it's actually fragile. It's because if you do scrutinize it, it might become brittle and fall apart. So regarding your question about forbidden knowledge, so let me give you an example of forbidden knowledge. As an evolutionary psychologist, one of the topics that I study are evolved sex differences. There are many things that make men and women similar to one another, but there are many things that make men and women different from each other for very clear biological and evolutionary reasons. Well, that itself has now become a form of forbidden knowledge, because if the sex difference that you study comes out, if the findings come out in support of the politically correct orthodoxy, then thank you, Dr. Saad. What a great scientist you are. If the findings come out not in support of your, orthodoxy, boo, boo, Nazi, Nazi. And so again, this shows you what happens when you have scientific pursuits being parasitized by ideology. It's a dreadful idea.